President Biden met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel in the Oval Office Thursday. He's looking to deliver on a campaign promise to recalibrate America's relationship with its European allies. In a news conference after their meeting, President Biden said they agreed to stand up against adversaries like China and Russia. He also reaffirmed the U.S. and Germany's shared commitment to defending democracy worldwide.
Both our nations understand the imperative of proving that democracies can deliver the needs of our people in the second quarter of the 21st century. We will stand up for democratic principles and universal rights when we see China or any other country working to undermine free and open societies. And we are united in our commitment to addressing democratic backsliding, corruption, phony populism in the European Union or among candidates for the EU membership or anywhere we find it in the world.
Meanwhile, the rest of his party is working out the details on an infrastructure package. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer laid out a timeline for the two-track plan. He will hold a vote next Wednesday to open up debate on a bipartisan deal. That day is also the deadline for Democrats to finalize their budget resolution.
Everyone has been having productive conversations, and it's important to keep the two-track process moving. The time has come to make progress. And we will. We must.
We'll have more on its chances of passing in a moment, but the issue which continues to shape much of what's happening in Washington is the deadly January 6th riot at the Capitol. After the Senate stonewalled a potential committee to investigate it, Speaker Pelosi's new panel is taking shape in the House. The first hearings will be held by month's end. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has not yet announced which Republican members will serve on the panel. McCarthy is meeting with former President Trump in New Jersey Thursday. After initially blaming Mr. Trump for the insurrection at the Capitol, McCarthy has now positioned himself firmly behind him. McCarthy was instrumental in removing Congresswoman Liz Cheney from leadership for her criticisms of the former president's false claims of widespread election fraud. So far, former Vice President Mike Pence is one of the few high-profile Republicans willing to contradict the former president's version of what happened on January 6th. Here's what he said at a GOP event in New Hampshire a few weeks ago.
January 6th was a dark day in the history of the United States Capitol. But thanks to the swift action of the Capitol Police and federal law enforcement, violence was quelled. The Capitol was secured. And that same day, we reconvened the Congress and did our duty under the Constitution and the laws of the United States. You know, President Trump and I have spoken many times since we left office. And I don't know if we'll ever see eye to eye on that day.
For more, let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns, Tamara Keith, and Sarah Mucha. Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter. Tamara is NPR's White House correspondent and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. And Sarah is a political reporter for Axios. Welcome. It's good to have you all. Tamara, let me start with you. What does the timing of Minority Leader McCarthy's meeting with the former president tell us? And do you think it could impact the Republicans selected for the January 6th committee?
Certainly, the timing is that it's before Kevin McCarthy has to make this decision. And the minority leader seems to be consulting with the former president, certainly doesn't want to cross or upset the former president. Otherwise, he wouldn't be spending time with him. He wouldn't have gone to meet with him in Mar-a-Lago earlier this year. But the minority leader needs the former president on board for the 2022 midterm elections. And that's what is looming over all of this, is how this commission, how this committee's work will end up playing come 2022, which it turns out is not that far away.
Yeah, I know. It really is hard to believe we're already halfway into July here. August is just around the corner. 2022 is not that far away. Caitlin, though, it has been more than 6 months since the Capitol riot, and the former president has continued to downplay his potential role in inciting the violence. What is the symbolism of the minority leader meeting with the former president as Republicans eye the midterms?
That's exactly right. And Kevin McCarthy himself has downplayed over the past 6 months the president's involvement. Remember, when it happened, he was critical of the president and has since now backed away from that criticism. And as you mentioned in the lead-in, a lot has happened over the past 6 months within the Republican Party. You've not only had members downplaying what happened on that day, you've had Liz Cheney ousted from leadership, and you've had Elise Stefanik come into leadership, really promoting her relationship with the former president. When you are in the minority party in Washington, you're always trying to plot your path back into power. And that's exactly what McCarthy is focused on now. He is focused on winning back the majority in the House for Republicans. He believes that they came really close in 2020 and believes that they have a good shot in 2022. And he believes that Donald Trump is going to be critical for Republicans in that effort. Not only himself, but the base that Trump brings in. They can't afford, in his strategy, to lose that base of support. So that's why you see him kind of really continuing to stand behind the former president, going as far to meet with him on his own turf as he is doing today. And that really signals kind of how Republicans feel they need, or what their strategy is in terms of winning back the House. And of course, you know, this comes to the big question that we have is whether he talked to the former president about selecting members for this January 6th committee, and what he talked to him about in terms of having the former president involved in the midterms. He can no longer tweet, but he does send out lots of statements. He's been making endorsements here and there around the country. So the level of involvement and what McCarthy wants from him is an open question.
Sarah, over in the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's previously stated goal was blocking President Biden's agenda, as he did with President Obama. Yet on infrastructure, he's been fairly quiet. Might he be open to giving President Biden a deal?
That's right. I think we even talked about this last week. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has historically deemed himself as an obstructionist when it came to the Democratic agenda. But you're right. He has been fairly quiet on this issue of infrastructure. He's criticized, of course, the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill that Democrats would hope to pass alone. But in terms of the bipartisan package, there is a chance, I wouldn't say yes or no either way, but there is a chance he may support it, because at the end of the day, infrastructure is extremely politically popular. When people step outside and they see new roads, they see the potholes fixed on their way to school, both parties want to be able to take ownership of that and say, look at this change that we made in your lives. And again, as we've noted several times already, that the midterms are coming up. That's going to be very important, especially as both in the Senate and in the House, Republicans try to regain their majority.
Yeah, these infrastructure projects are really tangible things that politicians on both sides of the aisle can take credit for. Well, Caitlin, you spoke with Illinois Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth a little earlier, asking about her support for the $3.5 trillion budget plan. Here's some of that conversation.
I do support the bill. I very much like the basic concept that we need to make these investments in our nation for our economy to grow. And we also need to make these investments in the American people, into the infrastructure of the family, so that people can get back to work and be productive and have access to the support that they need to do their jobs, so that they can go out and work outside the home. So I also really like the fact that this is all intended to be paid for.
Caitlin, what else did she tell you about President Biden's role in getting this and other legislation through before the midterms?
Right. Well, Biden was on Capitol Hill, his old stomping grounds, yesterday to meet with Democrats and to really kind of encourage them to be able to pass this bill. And I asked her, because every time we're on the Hill and we're talking about infrastructure, we hear from Democratic lawmakers that they appreciate the president's efforts to try to get bipartisan support for infrastructure, but they also have a lot of promises to keep with the people who helped elect them, they argue. And you've heard a lot of griping from some Democrats, especially more liberal Democrats, that they wanted to go at this alone through reconciliation and really get this through. So I asked, if Biden had waited, too long to do this, whether he, the efforts to try to attract Republicans to his side were wasted. And Duckworth said, look, this is a president who has the most experience with the Senate. He knows the Senate better than any president in history, she said. So she thought that he was doing a good job in trying the bipartisan route, that there still is potential for that, but they also need to deliver on these promises. And, as we know, the window on Capitol Hill for legislation with those midterms right around the corner really is narrowing. And we're just a couple of weeks away from August recess. We know that it's very difficult to kind of keep momentum on a measure on Capitol Hill without a big pressure point. So you do have a lot of progressives in Congress really wanting to push forward on these priorities so that they can not only, go back to their constituents and say, look what we've done, but also to make this a big calling card in the midterm elections.
On the economic front, Tamara, the IRS began sending monthly child tax credit payments to some 36 million households Thursday. They're intended to help lower-income families hit by the pandemic. What is the potential political implication of these payments?
Certainly, the Biden administration would like these payments not just to be a temporary relief during the pandemic, but actually to continue. Part of the rough framework that was agreed to in that $3.5 trillion budget framework for the American Families Plan includes extending these child tax credits, these refundable child tax credits. So the money comes into people's checking accounts or arrives as a check, whether they owed taxes or not. And this is seen by Democrats. This has been a long-time goal of Democrats and is seen as a way of dramatically reducing childhood poverty, which is something that has been a great concern, especially for many progressive Democrats. So the White House is certainly trying to draw attention to this. They've made a big push a couple of weeks ago to tell people, do media interviews, go out there, tell people about how to make sure they get these tax credits. And now they are arriving, and they want people to know that they came from the Democrats in Congress and the White House because this has the potential to be a very popular program if people know where the money came from and what the purpose of it was. Often, though, money shows up. There have been other tax cuts and programs in the past where there really isn't much of a political benefit that rolls down to the party that made it happen, simply because people don't fully understand where it came from or how it ended up in their paycheck.
Right. One thing people do understand, and we have been seeing, Sarah, is food and fuel prices continuing to rise, and business leaders are now raising concerns about inflation. Now, the White House has continued to say that this is a temporary part of pandemic recovery. They use the word transitory to describe what is happening. But could inflation foil the White House's big spending plans?
It's definitely a concern that is top of mind. Inflation is the reason that people don't want to see more spending happen. And as we're seeing here, Democrats are hoping to spend $3.5 trillion on a standalone bill, part of that infrastructure package that we were just talking about. But as you just mentioned, different CEOs and business leaders are worried about the future of these prices continuing to stay up. Senator Joe Manchin also warned, he's a Democrat, but he warned against that. He said, my constituents back in West Virginia are noticing this increase in prices. And just this week, Axios held a focus group with swing voters, and they were asked, was your 4th of July barbecue more expensive? Was it noticeably more expensive than it was last year? And overwhelmingly, folks said yes, and they've noticed the increase in these food and fuel prices. What we're going to see coming up next is certain group of Republicans asked Treasury Secretary Yellen to come up to the White House or come up to the Hill rather for a private lunch to brief them on these inflation concerns, obviously top of mind for folks up here. So we'll see if she accepts that invitation, and that would be happening next week.
All right, we'll be watching for that, because you're right, people are noticing, and the question is, if it's transitory, well, how long is transitory? How long are we talking about for these increased prices? Caitlin, I want to ask you sort of a big picture question. A new Gallup poll is showing that in 2021, public trust in American institutions dropped to 33%. How does political identity factor into this?
Yeah, and a big part of this conversation with this poll was, COVID obviously was so incredibly disruptive to people's lives that it ended up shaking confidence in their trust of American institutions, a variety of them. A couple of different points to kind of focus on, again, as we're talking about the midterms, as we're talking about maybe some of these cultural issues that will come up in terms of issues in the midterms. A couple of points that stood out to us was the partisan divides on public schools, confidence in public schools. Of course, this is big conversation with the critical race theory, and public confidence in policing. And the breakdown on partisan lines was really striking. So when it comes to confidence in policing, you have about 76% of Republicans having confidence versus 21% of Democrats. When it comes to confidence in public schools, you have only 20% of Republicans and 43% of Democrats. So as we're seeing kind of this big shakeup in terms of confidence, it's also having a partisan effect. And one other big number to look at is the confidence in the presidency. And now this is a number that kind of shifts depending on whoever is in power. But this is where we saw the biggest gap between Democrats and Republicans, with only 13% of Republicans having confidence in the presidency and 62% of Democrats having confidence in the presidency. It's a 49% difference. It's a huge difference. Again, this happens every time the party in power versus they're compared to who's in power. So just an interesting number, especially as we talk about this.
Yeah, it is interesting, Caitlin, and it's something to watch here, to see where those numbers are maybe in a year, 6 months from now. Right. Tamara, a number of tell-all books are coming out about former President Trump's final days in office. Washington Post reporters Carol Leonnig and Philip Rucker's entitled "I Alone Can Fix It: Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year" comes out next week, but they detail concerns from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, about President Trump potentially trying to use the military to stay in office. They write, quote, "Milley described a stomach-churning feeling as he listened to Trump's untrue complaints of election fraud, drawing a comparison to the 1933 attack on Germany's parliament building that Hitler used as a pretext to establish a Nazi dictatorship." What do we know, Tamara, about any contingency plans that Milley may have made?
Well, the reporting in the book, the Rucker and Leonnig book, says that there was a contingency, that they had this plan where a series of top military officials would resign rather than being ordered to do something that they didn't believe was legal, constitutional, or ethical. How far that actually went is unclear, but certainly the reporting in the book makes it clear that Milley was thinking about these things, worrying about these things. Certainly, the president's response to the racial justice protests over the summer, and Milley not actually feeling very good about the fact that he walked with the former president through Lafayette Park over to St. John's Church, where the former president held up a Bible after that park had been cleared of protesters. Milley, in uniform, later saying that he wished he hadn't been there and apologizing for being there because it sent the wrong message about the role of the U.S. military in the civilian power structure in the United States. All of this indicates that Milley did have concerns. and other people within the government did have concerns about what was happening. Also, think back, there was that letter, that open letter or op-ed from former defense secretaries right before January 6th. So there have been moments of pause along the way, which now, as these books come out, are sort of wrapped together with a narrative that makes things that seemed like they were in isolation a few months ago come into focus as part of a larger picture of what was happening at that time.
That's right. And Sarah, what has been the response to some of these details, specifically with respect to this characterization of General Milley's, actions and feelings at the time? What's been the response from former President Trump himself?
That's right. Well, the former president is not happy with the characterizations about him in these books. They do not obviously paint him in the greatest light. You saw statements before saying they're completely false, they're inaccurate. And that being said, though, we are seeing the president out on the trail. He's out campaigning. He's holding rallies. I wouldn't call it necessarily a campaign trail quite yet, but he is promoting himself, and he's sort of trying to create that message around himself to frame the narrative in a way that he can. And continually, I think, something that we probably all know about the former president, but Meredith McGraw reported in Politico that aides are saying, for him, he kind of thinks that all press is good press. So no matter what is being said out there, at least he's still being talked about and he's still relevant.
All right, to be continued, I have a feeling. Caitlin Huey-Burns, Tamara Keith, and Sarah Mucha, it's great to have you all. Thank you so much.